What happens when a great leader departs? How does God ensure his work continues without interruption? Today we're exploring one of the most dramatic moments in biblical history, the day a fiery chariot appeared from heaven and a prophet was taken up in a whirlwind. Our story begins with a journey, but not just any journey. Elijah, knowing his time on earth is ending, takes his successor Elisha through a series of significant locations: Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, and finally across the Jordan River. This wasn't a random path. These locations traced Israel's original entry into the Promised Land, but in reverse order. It's as if Elijah was saying to Elisha, "Remember how our people entered this land with such promise? Look how far we've fallen into idolatry." Each step backward through these historic sites represented Israel's regression from covenant faithfulness. 3 times during this journey, Elijah tests Elisha with the words, "Stay here." But each time, Elisha responds with remarkable determination.
"As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you."
This wasn't a casual commitment. In my years observing leadership transitions, I've seen this same pattern repeatedly. The most successful transitions always involve this level of determination we see in Elisha. When I watched a senior pastor preparing to hand over leadership responsibilities at his church, those who said, "I won't leave until I've received everything I need from you," were those who ultimately flourished in ministry. Elisha recognized something precious was at stake. He refused to miss this critical moment for any reason. His persistence teaches us that spiritual inheritance requires tenacity and devotion. Meanwhile, at both Bethel and Jericho, communities of prophets approached Elisha with a startling revelation.
"Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you?"
As Elijah and Elisha approach the Jordan River, something remarkable happens. Elijah takes his mantle, his prophet's cloak, rolls it up, and strikes the water. Immediately, the river parts, creating dry ground for them to cross. This miracle deliberately echoes the parting of the Red Sea under Moses and the Jordan under Joshua. Like a royal herald announcing the arrival of a king, this miracle signals that something even greater is about to happen. Once across, Elijah asks what he can do for Elisha before he's taken away. Elisha's request is profound.
"Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me."
This wasn't about seeking twice as much power. Elisha was using legal language from inheritance law. Just as the firstborn son received a double portion of his father's estate as recognition of his responsibility to continue the family legacy, Elisha was asking to be confirmed as Elijah's spiritual heir with the authority needed to continue his prophetic work. Then comes the dramatic climax of their journey.
As they continued walking and talking, behold, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven.
The fiery chariots and horses represent God's angelic armies that constantly surround his servants. Just as military honors are given to retiring generals, God sent his heavenly host to escort his faithful prophet home in divine splendor. Witnessing this astonishing sight, Elisha cries out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." This wasn't just grief speaking. Elisha recognized that Elijah's spiritual authority and prayers had been Israel's true defense, more powerful than all the king's horsemen and chariots combined. One man aligned with God outweighed all of Israel's military might. The text tells us Elisha then tore his clothes in grief. This detail reminds us that even when succession is planned and expected, the loss of spiritual mentors is deeply felt. I remember standing at the graveside of my own spiritual father, a pastor who had guided me through my early years of ministry. Though I had been prepared to take up leadership, tears flowed freely. Preparation for succession doesn't eliminate grief. Elisha's torn garments show us that even when God's plan is unfolding perfectly, our human hearts still feel the pain of separation. There's something deeply authentic about his emotional response. He doesn't stoically accept what's happening, but openly acknowledges the personal loss, even amid the divine glory he witnesses. As the dust settles and the heavenly chariot disappears from view, Elisha faces his first moment alone. The text tells us,
He took up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan.
This fallen mantle symbolized the transfer of prophetic authority. Like a king's signet ring passing to his successor, the mantle represented authorized power. But would it work for Elisha as it had for Elijah? With all eyes watching, Elisha strikes the waters and cries out,
"Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?"
He wasn't questioning God's presence but inviting divine confirmation of his calling, and confirmation came immediately. The waters parted just as they had for Elijah. Every new leader must eventually face their own Jordan River, a challenge that requires more than human ability. It's when we call upon the God of Elijah, the same God who empowered those before us, that we find the power to fulfill our calling. Elisha's success at the Jordan proved his authority not just to others, but perhaps even to himself. The prophetic communities immediately recognized this transfer of power, declaring,
"The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha."
Their public acknowledgement established Elisha's legitimacy and prevented future challenges to his authority. They became the first witnesses who could testify, "We see the same power at work in him that we saw in Elijah."
"Behold now, there are with your servants 50 strong men. Please let them go and seek your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has caught him up and cast him upon some mountain or into some valley."
This reveals our human tendency to reduce the supernatural to what fits our experience. After a church experiences powerful revival, people often search for natural explanations rather than simply accepting God's intervention. These prophets were like the disciples who couldn't accept Jesus' resurrection predictions. Their minds couldn't grasp what their theology should have prepared them for. Their insistence on searching mountains and valleys for Elijah's body reveals how we often struggle to accept God's supernatural interventions, even when they fulfill his word. Though Elisha knew their search would be fruitless, he eventually yielded to their request. This shows his pastoral wisdom. Sometimes people must learn through experience rather than just being told. Their fruitless 3-day search accomplished what Elisha's words alone could not: absolute conviction that Elijah was truly gone, leaving no earthly remains.
"The water is bad and the land is causing death."
Elisha responds by throwing salt into the water source, healing it permanently. This miracle, where salt, which normally prevents growth, becomes an agent of healing, illustrates how God can take instruments of judgment and turn them into means of grace. The second incident occurs as Elisha travels toward Bethel, a center of idolatry. As he was going up the road, some youths came from the city and mocked him, saying, "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" These weren't innocent children playing harmless pranks. The Hebrew term refers to young men old enough to be held accountable. Their taunt, "Go up, bald head," wasn't merely appearance-based ridicule, but had theological significance. They were essentially saying, if you're really Elijah's successor, why don't you disappear into the sky too? Challenging his prophetic claim and mocking Elijah's ascension. When Elisha pronounces judgment, 2 bears emerge from the woods and maul 42 of these youths. The seemingly disproportionate response underscores a spiritual principle we often forget: contempt for God's word brings consequences. I once counseled a young man who habitually mocked Christianity, urging him to consider the dangerous path he was on, not because I predicted bears would attack him, but because rejecting God's truth carries consequences. These 42 young men represented organized opposition to God's prophet in a center of idolatry. The regional impact of this event would have been immediate and sobering. God's prophet cannot be mocked with impunity. So what does this dramatic chapter teach us today? First, God ensures continuity in his work by raising up new leaders when others depart. The mantle may change hands, but God's purposes never falter. Second, spiritual mentorship matters deeply. The relationship between Elijah and Elisha demonstrates the biblical pattern of discipleship and leadership development that continues to shape faithful ministry today. Third, God's work often includes both mercy and judgment. Elisha's ministry began with both healing waters and the judgment of the bears, establishing the full scope of prophetic work. Finally, this chapter reminds us that God is not bound by natural laws. The dramatic translation of Elijah into heaven points toward the ultimate hope of all believers, that death is not the final word. When great leaders depart, God's work doesn't stop. The mantle falls, but new hands are always prepared to take it up. And when they do, the same God who empowered those who went before stands ready to part the waters once again. Music concludes. End credits.